Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. She was 19 years old when they left her at the edge of Carrion Canyon, and not one of them looked back. The rope they'd used to tie her wrists had been cut, not as a mercy, but because they didn't want to waste it. Her boots were gone, her horse was gone. The canteen she'd carried since she was 12, the one with the dented copper lid and the initials scratched in by her grandmother's fingernail, that was gone too. The sun was a hammer. The canyon walls were red as old blood. She stood at the rim, her bare feet burning on the flat rock, watching the dust from their horses rise and disappear into the blinding sky. Nobody said her name. Nobody hesitated. They just rode away, like she was already dead. Her name was Sable Dune, and she was not dead yet. She dropped to her knees, not from weakness, but to press her palms flat against the hot stone, to feel something real while everything she knew evaporated. The canyon below her was 1,000 feet of silence and shadow. The wind moved through it like a low, slow breath. She could smell water, somewhere deep, somewhere hidden, and that smell was the only reason she didn't collapse. Somewhere below her, there was water, and as long as there was water, there was a reason to move. She climbed down into the canyon with her bare hands and bleeding feet, inch by inch, because going back up meant going back to them. Going down meant something else. She didn't know what, but the canyon swallowed her whole, and the red walls closed around her like a secret. And for 6 years, the world above forgot she was alive. Sable Dune hadn't always lived at the edge of things. She grew up in the town of Ashveil, a dry little settlement that clung to the flatlands like a burr on a saddle blanket. Her father, Colt Dune, ran a livery and a crutch, both with equal stubbornness. He had 3 sons from his first wife and 1 daughter from his second, and it was always clear which children belonged to the town story and which one had been written in pencil, easy to erase. Sable learned to ride before she learned to read. She fixed fences, hauled water, and broke horses that grown men wouldn't touch. She was useful. But useful was not the same as loved. The Ashveil brothers were the ones who rode into Ashveil 6 months before Sable disappeared. 3 brothers, Decker, Marsh, and the youngest, Bryn, all lean and sun-darkened, with easy smiles and cold eyes. They bought land west of the canyon and started running cattle. Decker, the oldest, had a way of speaking to people that made them feel important while he was stealing from them. He spoke to Sable like she mattered, and she, who had never once been made to feel that way, mistook that attention for truth. She worked for them willingly. She mapped the canyon trails for them. She told them where the water tables ran underground. She showed them the hidden paths through the red cliffs that no outsider had ever found, because her grandmother had shown it to her in whispers. She gave them everything, and Decker smiled each time and called her the smart one, and she believed him. The cattle started disappearing in the spring. Stolen, people said. And then someone, she never learned who, pointed a finger south towards Sable Dune. The sheriff, who owed Decker a favor, asked no questions. Her father, Colt, who had always looked at her with vague disappointment, did not stand up. And just like that, the girl who knew every stone in Ashveil became the girl who stole from it. The trial lasted 40 minutes. There was no judge in Ashveil that week. only a circuit lawyer named Foss, who had liquor on his breath and land dealings with the Orwells. The courtroom was the back half of the general store, with flour sacks for seats and a tin roof that ticked in the afternoon heat. Sable stood in the center with her wrists bound, looking at the faces of people she had known her whole life. They looked back the way people look at a stray dog someone says has bitten. Not with anger, exactly, but with relief that the decision had already been made. Decker Orwell testified that he'd seen her driving cattle toward the canyon at dusk. Marsh backed up every word with the calm confidence of a man who had rehearsed. Prynne, the youngest, the one with hollow cheeks and something skittish behind his eyes, said nothing and kept his gaze on the floor. Nobody noticed that. Nobody but Sable. She watched Prynne's jaw clench and unclench, like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow, and she filed that moment away, like a coin in a pocket. Her father was called. He stood up slowly, a tall man, gone thin at the shoulders, and when the lawyer asked if his daughter had a history of dishonesty, Dune said the worst thing a father can say. He said, "I wouldn't know for certain." 4 words, not a condemnation, not a defense, just a door left open for the worst to walk through. Sable did not cry. She looked at him until he sat down and didn't look up again. The verdict was exile, not hanging. They were too small a town for hanging to feel clean, just banishment. Taken to the rim of Carrion Canyon and left. It was supposed to be a death sentence dressed in Mercy's clothes, and they all knew it. The rope came off, the boots came off, and the world's Sable Dune had built herself inside, brick by quiet brick, came off too. The canyon was not empty. That was the first surprise. Sable found the river on the second day, a thin green thread running along the canyon floor between rocks, the color of dried rust. She drank with both hands and her face in the water like an animal, and she felt no shame in that. Shame was a luxury. Survival was the currency down here. She followed the river south, walking on flat stones to spare her feet, watching the walls above her for movement. The canyon was a mile deep in places and half a mile wide. Big enough to get lost in, small enough to eventually understand. On the 4th day, she found the cave. It wasn't large, just a shallow gouge in the eastern wall, about 15 feet deep and high enough to stand in, with a natural ledge at the back where water had once pooled and left a flat, smooth surface like a table. Someone had been here before. There were old fire marks on the ceiling, a rusted tin can, and scratched into the stone wall, barely visible under years of dust, a set of words. She outlasted them all. Sable touched those words with one finger. She didn't know who had written them or when, but she pressed her palm flat against the stone and made a decision right there that would carry her for 6 years. She did not try to climb out. Not yet. Not until she had a plan. Instead, she learned the canyon. She mapped it in her memory, the way she once mapped it on paper for Decker Orwell. Every passage, every shelf of rock, every underground seep of fresh water. She found wild onion and dry root herbs and a population of jackrabbits, so unbothered by silence they practically walked into her hands. She learned to make traps from split branches. She learned which stones held heat longest through the cold nights. She built a life the hard way, one stubborn, furious inch at a time. Time moves differently at the bottom of a canyon. It doesn't march. It pools. The seasons came to Sable in colors, amber in fall when the canyon walls caught the late sun, white and iron gray in winter when snow fell in silence and stacked up along the ledges, a violent, almost painful green in spring when the river swelled and the sparse canyon brush burst with something like joy. She knew the exact pitch of the wind before rain. She knew which cracks in the rock held spiders and which held moisture. She knew the canyon the way you know your own heartbeat. Without thinking, without stopping, always there. She was not untouched by those years. Her face had sharpened. The softness that comes with being fed and sheltered and thought about had been replaced by something leaner and harder, like wood that's been out in the weather long enough to stop rotting and start hardening. Her hair had grown past her shoulders, dark and tangled. Her hands were strong and scarred, but her eyes were the most changed. They had become very still, the way deep water is still and very watchful, the way someone watches who has learned the cost of looking away. She thought about Prynne Orwell more than she wanted to, not with longing, with question. She replayed that courtroom moment again and again. His jaw, the flaw, the thing he wouldn't swallow. There was a word for what she saw in him: knowledge. He had known she was innocent. He had sat there and known it and said nothing. And that silence had dropped her into this canyon. She didn't hate him the way she hated Decker. Decker's cruelty was clean and intentional. Prynne's was worse. It was cowardice wrapped in the same skin as regret. She thought about the words on the cave wall, too. She outlasted them all. Someone had survived something here before her, and if they had, so would she. Up in Ashveil, 6 years passed with the particular cruelty of a town that doesn't examine itself. The Orwell brothers grew comfortable. Decker married a merchant's daughter and built a 2-story house on the western edge of town, the kind of house meant to be looked at. Marsh became something like a deputy, not official, but close enough to authority that people flinched when he walked past. The cattle operation expanded. The land Sable's grandmother had once owned, left to Sable in a letter that somehow never reached the probate, became part of the Orwell range. It was so tidy, so complete. It looked exactly like how things were always going to turn out. But Prynne drank. He had started the year after the trial and never fully stopped. He drank quietly at first, and then loudly, and then desperately, the way men drink when something inside them won't be silent. He picked fights he couldn't win. He lost 2 horses to bad gambling. His brothers grew impatient with him. He was messy in a way that was beginning to reflect poorly on the clean story they'd built. By the 5th year, Prynne was sleeping in the loft of the family barn, barely trusted with minor work, a ghost at the edges of his own brother's success. Nobody connected his unraveling to a girl left at the canyon rim. Or if they did, they kept that thought very private. And then there was heroine, a rancher who had arrived in Ashveil in Sable's 3rd year underground. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with a border collie named Smoke that he let run free across his land. Harrow asked few questions, minded his cattle, and grew the kind of reputation you earn by simply not doing wrong things. He'd heard about Sable Dune the way everyone had, as a cautionary tale, told quickly, not dwelt on. He didn't know the canyon was 30 minutes south of his eastern fence line. He didn't know that yet. It began on a Tuesday in late October, when the air had turned crisp and the canyon floor was loud with the sound of the river running fast from early rains. Harrow Vane was mending fence on his eastern line when Smoke went rigid. The dog had been trotting ahead, nose down, doing her usual inventory of the morning, when something stopped her. She stood with her legs locked and her ears sharp and let out a single low bark that Harrow had learned over 8 years of partnership meant, "This is not nothing." He walked to where she stood and looked south toward the canyon rim. Nothing visible, no movement, just the flat red scrubland running toward the edge, and below that, the silence of the canyon. Smoke barked again, then again. Then she started running toward the rim, stopping every 20 feet to look back at him with an expression that was as close to urgency as a dog's face can hold. Harrow followed. At the canyon rim, he saw nothing at first, just the drop and the red walls, and far below, the glitter of the river. Then Smoke lay down flat on the edge and whimpered, and Harrow got down on his belly beside her and looked. And there, on a shelf of rock, about 40 feet below the rim, was a woman. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, perfectly still, watching the sky with eyes that had long since stopped being surprised by anything. She was wearing clothes made partly from things he didn't recognize. Animal hide, he realized, cut and laced with strips of something. Her hair was long and dark, and she was looking directly up at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Harrow Vane said the simplest thing he could think of. "Do you need a rope?" The woman on the ledge was quiet for another moment, and then, like someone opening a door they'd kept shut for a very long time, she said, "Yes." The rope was 40 feet of good braided hemp, and Harrow anchored it around a boulder and threw it over without ceremony. Sable did not rush. She stood on the ledge and studied the rope the way you study something before you trust it. Not with fear, but with the patience of a person who has been betrayed by things that looked solid before. Then she tied it around her waist in a knot that made Harrow raise his eyebrows slightly when she reached the top. It was a proper canyon knot, the kind you don't learn casually. When she cleared the rim and stood upright on flat land for the first time in 6 years, she didn't wobble. She just stood there and breathed and looked north toward where Ashveil sat on the horizon like something she'd been dreaming about in 2 different ways. One a homecoming, one a reckoning. Harrow gave her water from his canteen. She drank slowly, which impressed him. A desperate person drinks all at once. She drank like she had learned that the body needs patience as much as water. He asked no questions. He gave her his riding jacket because the October air had teeth, and she put it on without comment. Smoke sat at her feet and leaned into her leg with total conviction, and Sable looked down at the dog for a long moment with an expression that was the closest she'd come to crying since that first night in the canyon 6 years ago. "What's the dog's name?" she asked. "Smoke." She nodded like that was the right name. "What's yours?" "Harrow Vane. Ranch about a mile north." She looked at him carefully, the way she now looked at everything, with all of herself, with no wasted attention. "You're not Orwell." It wasn't a question, but he answered it like one. "No, I am not." She let out a breath that had years in it. "Then I'll accept your hospitality." She walked north beside him without looking back at the canyon rim. Smoke ran circles around both of them, as if she had been waiting for this exact morning. Sable did not go to Ashveil the first week, or the second. She stayed at Harrow's ranch, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen that smelled of cedar and old leather, eating slow and deliberately, regaining her land legs. Harrow asked nothing. He worked. She watched how he ran his land and recognized something she'd almost forgotten. What it looked like when a person builds something honest. On the 10th day, she asked him to ride her into town. He didn't ask why. He just saddled 2 horses. Ashveil had not changed much in 6 years, but it felt smaller, the way places always do when you've been somewhere enormous. People on the main street stopped and stared. A woman dropped a basket. A man who used to buy hay from her father took 3 steps backward, like he'd seen a ghost. Because as far as anyone in Ashveil knew, that's exactly what she was. She walked her horse down the center of the street toward the sheriff's office, and before she reached it, the door opened and Prin Orwell came out. He looked terrible, hollowed and grey, like something had been eating at him from the inside for 6 years and was nearly done. He stopped on the step when he saw her. And then something in his face broke open the way ice breaks on a river in spring. Not slowly, not gracefully, but all at once. He said, "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. He told everything, right there in the street, with half the town watching. He told it loudly and completely, the way a man confesses who has carried a thing too long and can feel it killing him. Decker's plan, the staged evidence, the cattle moved by their own hired hand the night before the trial, their father's instructions, every detail. And as he spoke, Decker Orwell came out of the saloon across the street and stood very still when he understood that his youngest brother had just dismantled 6 years of careful construction in 3 minutes. The sheriff, a new one now, hired 2 years back, listened with his arms crossed and his expression tight and hard. The new sheriff's name was Caden Moss, and he was not a man who owed the Orwells anything. Decker and Marsh were taken into custody by sundown. The evidence Prin provided, including a ledger he'd kept hidden for 4 years in the barn loft, recording every transaction and lie, was more than enough. The circuit judge arrived within the week, and this time the trial lasted longer than 40 minutes. It lasted 3 days, and when it ended, the Orwell name was not a power in Ashveil anymore. It was a warning. Sable's grandmother's land came back to her through the probate office, which had its own quiet reckoning when the original documents resurfaced. 14 acres, the eastern spring, and the trail rights to the canyon pass. She stood at the property line on the morning the deed was signed and looked at the land with the particular emotion of someone reclaiming something they once gave away without meaning to. It didn't look like justice exactly. It looked like ground, solid, indifferent, patient ground that had been waiting for the right person to stand on it. Prin Orwell was not charged. He testified fully and cooperated without negotiation, and the judge made his decision accordingly. Sable was asked by the court how she felt about that outcome. She thought for a long moment. Then she said, "He was the one who could have saved me, and didn't. He was also the one who finally did. I can hold both of those things without needing to punish him for the first." The court recorder wrote that down. It felt important. Colt Dune, her father, came to the land on a grey morning in November, hat in hand, looking every one of his years. He stood at the fence line and didn't speak for a long time. Neither did she. Finally he said, "I should have stood up." She nodded. She didn't say it was all right. It wasn't. But she let him stand there, which was its own kind of answer. She built on that land through the winter, with Harrow's help and smoke underfoot every step. By spring, the first structure was standing, small, solid, hers. And on the wall inside, she scratched 4 words into the plaster with a nail. She outlasted them all,